I'm Will Oliver. I'm a professor of criminal justice at Sam Houston State University in Huntsville, Texas. So I'm mostly a policing scholar, which you'll note is what my presentation is today, and you're probably wondering what that has to do with Robert E. Howard. So last time I was on the symposium, I did a presentation. I used qualitative interviews of oil rig roughnecks from the 1950s to judge and test the veracity of Howard's statements about growing up in an oil boom town. So that kind of was a use of historical interviews, qualitative data to drive a Howard study. So this is my COVID study, okay? So during COVID, I had a lot of time, as most of us did. And so I decided to read, at that point, A Means to Freedom. So the letter exchange between Robert E. Howard and H.P. Lovecraft. And as I'm reading through it, they start talking a little bit about the police. Well, I'm a police scholar, so I perked up. I'm like, oh, this is interesting. And I figured, after the one exchange, that would be it. Well, they kept going. And I'm sitting there thinking, whoa, I got data, okay? This is great. So this ended up becoming the basis for a study, and that's what I'm going to present on. So it's public opinion of the police in the 1930s, America, and then it's examined through the Lovecraft-Howard debate. So public opinion polls really started after World War II. They weren't very good. If you've ever seen the picture of Truman holding up the newspaper that says, Dewey wins the election, well, the reason they did that was because it was based upon public opinion polls, which were clearly wrong. Truman won, if you don't know that. So it took a while for them to start perfecting the public opinion polls, and by the 1960s, they were pretty good. More random samples and things like that, so good statistics. However, it wasn't until crime started to increase in the 60s into the 70s that the public opinion polls started turning their attention toward the police. And they started asking public's opinion of the police. What do you think of the police? What do you think of their honesty? There was all kinds of different questions that came up. So we start seeing more and more of this kind of research, and that developed over time. Between the 1970s and 2000, there were 100 studies on public opinion of the police. And there was a meta-analysis of all 100 studies. And the thing is that there is no known study prior to the 1970s about the public opinion of the police. So obviously with no public opinion polls, we would have to find some other means to be able to judge the veracity of what the public was thinking of the police at an earlier time point. So my research question, which kind of was crafted based upon what I was reading, so took the data and formed the research question, what is the public opinion of the police during the 1930s, particularly in an era of Prohibition and the Great Depression? So that study found there was a whole bunch of things that were proposed that would influence the public opinion of the police. A whole bunch of, there was a lot of variables. But what they found was there was really only 4 that had any major influence, and consistently. And since then, there's been almost another 100 studies, and they consistently find the same things. So this is an area of research that is pretty well trodden, and we know we know 4 specific things. So the 4 things are age. Older people rely more upon the police. They have a greater, more positive attitude toward the police. The young typically don't like the police because they take away their fun. That one's easy, right? Personal contact with the police. This one's kind of a no-brainer too, right? If you have a negative contact with the police, well, you're going to have a negative opinion of the police. If you have a positive contact, you're likely to think highly of the police. That one's simple. Neighborhood. This is another one. Residence, where you live, so the urban versus rural, this keeps coming up. The problem with this one is it's mixed. So sometimes we find that people in the city don't like the police and people in the rural areas love the police. But some studies find the opposite, okay? So people in the cities like the police because, well, where's the most concentration of crime in the cities, and who comes to help them in the case of a crime? The police. Whereas in rural areas, the argument or the theory is that people that live in rural areas tend to be more freedom conscious. They bristle at anybody taking away their freedom or their rights, and therefore they have a more cautious attitude toward the police, which could be considered a negative attitude. The other one is race, consistently across time. Now, this one's really complicated, but the bottom line, pretty simple, is blacks have a more disfavorable attitude toward the police than whites do. Hispanics tend to line up with whites. They tend to have a favorable attitude. There's one confounding variable in all of this, and it convolutes everything, and that's political ideology. Are you a liberal or are you conservative? Conservatives tend to have a more positive attitude. Liberals tend to have a more negative attitude. It's not always a direct variable. It's a confounding one. So let me give you an example of race. Race, blacks tend to have a negative attitude toward the police. But if you have a population of black conservatives, they're going to have a positive attitude toward the police, which is then going to negate the race variable. So it confounds things and messes everything up, makes it more difficult for us. So the focus of the study is obviously with age. Lovecraft was a little bit older, but he wasn't so significantly older that would, kind of play into this. So and race, obviously they're both white. So those are out. But the two I can really concentrate on are personal contact and, again, neighborhood, the residents. So also I can focus on the confounding variable, which I'll talk about in a second here. So what I'm doing is historiography, where I'm utilizing old data, interviews, diaries, things like that, letter exchange between Howard and Lovecraft, to be able to utilize that as data to kind of test, in this case, what public opinion was like. It's not maybe necessarily the best way, but it's the only way we have at this point. So again, it's common within historical research. So I use Means to Freedom, 2 volumes, right? It's 1,000 pages. It's estimated to be over 400,000 words. I would imagine Rusty at probably one point knew exactly how many words were in that. Yeah, a lot. Takes a while to read. It's great reading, though. Now, the police coverage of it is very small. It's only 34 out of the 1,000 pages, which amounts to about 11,000 words out of over 400,000. So this is only a small piece of it. But again, it was that consistent exchange between the two. So separated out, we get less than really 1%. So this is a really small percentage, but yeah. So of course, with any presentation, I usually have to tell everybody who Howard and Lovecraft is. In this case, I don't, right? But here, what I can say is that what we do know, obviously, Howard lived in a small town. You're here, okay? Lovecraft lived in Providence. That's a large city, even at the time that Lovecraft lived there, okay? Also, we know that Howard was a liberal Democrat, whereas Lovecraft was a conservative Republican. So we've got that political ideology, right? We have the neighborhood, all right? And then the issue is contact. And they do have different contacts with the police. Not too much different, but different enough. And of course, Lovecraft, urban, etc. All right. So let's jump into it. The first mention of the police, because the cable wasn't very long, this is a little awkward, but the first actually came from Lovecraft to Howard, and this was July 25th, 1932. If a man started to shoot up a saloon in Boston or Providence, someone would tell a policeman, who in turn would telephone to the station from a corner box and bring 4 to 6 uniformed men in a fast patrol car. They would rush the maniac, probably using their guns, and quickly get him into the patrol and in a cell. Then he would be examined for sanity, tried, and placed either in an asylum or jail. Boy, those police in Providence, Rhode Island are really efficient, right? So Howard writes back, right, on August 9th. I note that some indignation of being expressed over the country in regard to the detestable police practice of grilling prisoners. It's about time. I think police harshness is mainly because the people have become so cowed by the heel of the law that they do not resent or resist any kind of atrocity inflicted on them by men wearing tin badges. So what you got here is very clearly he's concerned about the police taking away his freedom, and he bristles at the fact that other people just kind of roll over and play dead. So you start seeing some of that difference, and particularly with the rural in this case, playing into it. So Howard's experience with the police, because this is the one variable I haven't really talked about much between them. Howard said, I was nearly 14 years old before I lived for any length of time in a community which supported a law officer. So again, most of the places didn't have, the small towns he lived in, there was no police department. They relied either on the sheriffs or the state police as it was developing at that time in Texas. Again, you had the Texas Rangers, but another thing he says is, I've never been arrested. Okay, so we know that. And I've never had but one brush with the police, so he's had one contact. But I must say that did not increase my respect for the system. I was about 18 or 19, and the lad driving got confused, made a mistake, and drove across a stoplight. The cop who stopped us seemed to consider our blunder a personal insult. He lashed himself into a perfect rage. We were glad to be told the rules and regulations, but we did resent being treated like gangsters and thugs. So again, Howard had a personal contact. It was a negative one. He's more likely to have a negative attitude toward the police. Okay. Lovecraft's experience. I've never been arrested. Nobody I know has ever been arrested. And certainly the people I happen to know are no exceptional group in the community. So most people don't get arrested. It's like, okay. Then he also goes on to say, I've seen some cases of impatience and apparent overbearingness by traffic policemen, but have always had an inclination to pardon most of these in view of the constant irritation and nervous strain under which the guardians of heavy and complex traffic must labor. That kind of work and responsibility must wear down the nerves, even worse than the more seemingly arduous duties of the men on beats. So yes, sometimes they get a little aggressive, but it's okay. It's a stressful job, so we can excuse them. Again, a very positive attitude toward the police, and he's never had any contact with them other than maybe seeing the traffic cop, right? So on Robert E. Howard and Lovecraft on the urban versus rural. Robert E. Howard said, in a certain town where I happened to be staying, an officer had trouble with a certain private citizen. The officer came up to him suddenly on the street one day and shot him down without a word. If you were as familiar with the workings of Texas law as I am, you wouldn't even ask if the officer was acquitted. Of course he came clear. From what you say, this could never have happened in the East, but it did happen in Texas. So again, rural area, now the Veracity, trying to find this particular incident, unable to do so. So again, is he stretching the truth, highlighting emphasis? It's hard to say.
You really did try to find it.
What's that?
You really did try to find it.
Yes, I did. Yeah, trying to find in the time period and maybe within a couple years before, and I based it upon looking through the Cross Plains Review papers, but it's nothing came up. And how much time do I want to spend on that? Even though I had a lot of time because of COVID, right? Lovecraft on urban versus rural. Regarding the behavior of police in Texas, I must confess myself completely dumbfounded and bewildered by the array of data you bring up. No wonder our lifelong and instinctive reactions to law enforcement have been antipodally different. For truly, I never dreamed of the existence of such conditions as your reports indicate. It sounds like a piece of sensational and extravagant fiction in this day and age. And then in another place, in all my life, I never heard of any such complaints against the police here. Right? So police in Providence are perfect. Some other findings. One thing that came up was police corruption. Howard said, "I can't believe that the police machine works universally with anything like a smooth tread. The system as a whole is too corrupt." Lovecraft, "It is in the cities of the larger class of 1 million or more population that police corruption usually extends so far as to become a serious problem. Though even there no respectable person is often in danger unless he's engaged in certain trades affected by racketeering." In other words, police corruption only happens in the really, really big cities, and then it only happens against the bad guys, right? So we can excuse that. Again, that seems to be the sense of the attitude. Police brutality, again, a common topic that we hear a lot about today in the newspapers, and wasn't uncommon in the 1930s either. Howard, "Common people are sometimes driven to desperation by the brutality of the police." Lovecraft, "Even the cases of brutality sometimes reported usually have as their victims definite underworld characters whose real guilt in 1,000 ways is enough to make them deserve all that they get and more." Okay? Again, you're seeing somewhat that urban, rural, but you're also seeing that conservative versus liberal kind of perspective. And the third degree, which was at the time of beating confessions out of suspects, that was quite popular in the 20s and 30s and further back. Howard, "I know the grilling methods of the police, for instance, are supposed to be applied only to the worst thugs, but I am hardly innocent enough to be fooled by that." And Lovecraft, "As for the third degree, applied by police officers to prisoners, such methods are reserved for known members of the toughest criminal class." Similar comment. So discussion, personal experience, obviously they had different experiences, and it supports the research, even today in public opinion, that if you have a negative contact, you're likely to have a negative attitude toward the police, as Howard did. No contacts, right, or a positive contact, you're likely to think more positive of the police, as Lovecraft did. Urban versus rural, again, in this, because the research is mixed, but in this case, it was the rural having more of the negative attitudes toward the police than the urban. And then political ideology, that one fits as well. No different. The conservatives tend to be more supportive of the police. Liberals tend to have more negative attitudes toward the police. And then political corruption, brutality, and third degree all play out the same as well. And they fit into those other categories. So the conclusion is real simple. Not much has changed since the 1930s in regard to public opinion of the police and the United States of America. Thank you.
Thanks.